As members of a social species, we're highly attuned to one another. Many of our everyday behaviors, how we dress, what we like to do, and how we think about current events, are shaped by the people around us. Most of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are shaped by the social world, often without us even noticing. When we ask ourselves, why did they do that? The answer we come up with is our causal attribution of the situation. Causal attributions can be divided into two broad types: situational attributions and dispositional attributions. Situational attributions focus on factors external to the person, such as their expectations, rewards, or punishments, or even the weather. An example of a situational attribution is that we might see a woman smile warmly and believe that the situation demanded she be polite. Dispositional attributions, on the other hand, focus on the person themselves, such as their traits, preferences, and other personal qualities. So, looking at the same smiling woman, we might use a dispositional attribution and believe she smiled because she's joyful or friendly. Although it's nice to believe that we use actual evidence that we encounter in making these causal attributions, it turns out that we're influenced by a number of strong biases. These biases often lead us to overrule the evidence and misjudge people and situations. A really interesting example of this is that in the United States, the predominant culture tends to have a bias towards the dispositional approach to explaining human behavior. Meaning, we tend to think that people are in control of their own behaviors, and we underestimate the power of the situation. This is called the fundamental attribution error. When we hear someone yelling at another person, the most common attribution is that they are mean, easily angered, or unfriendly, rather than that they might be frustrated or disappointed about something that's happened. When we're driving and someone cuts us off, we might think that they're an inconsiderate scumbag, rather than thinking that they might be going towards something important and are distracted or incautious because of that. When making the fundamental attribution error, we regularly overlook obvious situational influences on behavior in favor of dispositional explanations. A classic example was demonstrated in a series of experiments known as the Quizmaster study. Student participants were randomly assigned to play the role of a questioner or contestant in a quiz game. Questioners developed difficult questions that they knew the answers to, and they presented these questions to the contestants. The contestants only answered 4 out of 10 questions correctly. After the task, both the questioners and the contestants were asked to rate their general knowledge compared to the average student. Now, questioners didn't rate their general knowledge any higher than the contestants, but the contestants rated the questioners' knowledge higher than their own. In a second study, they repeated the entire thing but had non-participating observers rate the knowledge of the contestants and questioners. In this study, observers also rated the questioner as having more general knowledge than the contestant. Of course, the obvious influence on the performance is the situation. The questioners wrote the question, so of course they have an advantage. The contestants and the observers knew this, but still made the internal attribution for the performance. They failed to make adequate allowance for the biasing effects of these questioner and answerer roles in judging the participants' general knowledge. Cross-cultural research on the fundamental attribution error has shown that it is most consistently made by people living in individualistic cultures, like the United States, Canada, and other Western countries where there's a focus on individual achievement and autonomy. In contrast, people from collectivistic cultures that focus on relationships with others, such as family, friends, and community, are less likely to commit the fundamental attribution error. These include many cultures in East Asia, Latin America, and Africa. A notable consequence of Westerners' tendency towards dispositional explanations is victim blaming. When people experience bad fortune, others tend to assume that they are responsible for it. For example, blaming people for being poor ignores situational factors that impact them, such as high unemployment rates, illness, or poor educational opportunities. This ideology is known as the just world hypothesis, the belief that people get the outcomes they deserve. Research has shown that people who hold strong just world beliefs are likely to have negative attitudes towards people who are unemployed, people living with AIDS, and women who have been raped. At the same time, a strong belief in a just world is associated with less dissatisfaction with negative events in one's own life. Of course, when judging the behaviors of others, we are necessarily working with partial information, and we must make inferences that organize our thinking. Imagine that a friend says her sister is especially outgoing. You might also falsely remember that your friend said her sister loves crowds, even though that was never mentioned. This is an example of how our knowledge of the world is a blend of our own observations and the inferences we make about what a person is really like and how they're likely to behave in the future. This is known as using implicit theories of personality. Implicit theories of personality can be enormously helpful and allow us to interpret the world without having to scrutinize every situation we encounter. Instead, we can fill in any information we're missing. However, though these steps make our social perceptions quick and efficient, they also leave us vulnerable to error, so that a perception of another person ends up more in line with our preconceptions than with the facts. This is particularly true in the context of stereotyping. Like our implicit theories of personality, stereotyping is a way of using information shortcuts about a specific group to navigate social situations or make decisions. You might hold a stereotype that elderly people are physically slower and frailer than 20-year-olds. If so, you'll be likely to treat interactions with older people in a different way. You might love to jump on a college friend's back or punch a buddy in the arm, but might not engage in these behaviors with older people. Stereotypical information may or may not be correct, and it may be positive or negative, but it is clear that it often leads to prejudice, that is, a negative attitude towards another person based on their group membership, and even to discrimination, that is, the unfair and cruel treatment of another person based on their group membership. Many factors foster the creation and maintenance of stereotypes, but one of the most important is the outgroup homogeneity effect. This is another bias in the way that we think about other people. Most of us, of course, have a lot of exposure to people in our own group, that is, our in-group. And as a result, we have ample opportunity to see that the group is diverse and made up of unique individuals. We generally have less exposure to other groups, that is, outgroups, and so, with little opportunity for learning, we are likely to perceive the group as merely a mass of more or less similar people. This is reflected in such statements as, all Asians are alike, or all women are alike. The first statement is, of course, almost invariably made by someone who is not Asian, the second by someone who is not a woman. Remarkably, this outgroup homogeneity effect can be created from even the simplest social manipulation. For example, if two classes of children want to play on the same soccer field, the classes will come to dislike each other not because of any real objectionable traits about the other group. The dislike originates from each class's favoritism towards itself and the fact that only one group can play on the soccer field at a time. With this preferential perspective for one's own group, people are not punishing the other one so much as neglecting it in favor of their own. However, to justify this preferential treatment, people will often exaggerate the differences between their in-group and the out-group. This results in the perception that the out-group is different than we are, and that they are all alike. So, how do social psychologists study constructs like stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination? In contexts where stereotyping is socially unacceptable, people are much less likely to endorse explicitly racist or sexist statements. So researchers must use more implicit measures to address how stereotypes and prejudices happen automatically, and often outside of our awareness. Even people who explicitly hold egalitarian views have been shown to hold, often unconsciously, assumptions about various outgroup members. To detect implicit assumptions and associations, researchers often rely on the implicit association test, or IAT. In a classic version of the IAT, research participants are asked to make two types of judgments. The first is whether a face they see on the computer screen is that of a black person or a white person, And the second is whether a word they see on the screen is a good word or a bad word. A good word would be like love, joy, or honest, and a bad word would be like poison, agony, detest. The trials with the faces, black or white, are intermixed with the trials with the words, good or bad. And participants must use the same two keys on the computer for both judgments. So in one part of the test, participants will use one key to indicate black if a black face is shown, and use that same key to indicate good if a good word is shown. Then a different key will be used for white for face trials and bad for word trials. In a different part of the test, things are arranged differently. Now, participants use one key to indicate black and bad, and the other key to indicate white and good. This experiment assesses how easily the participants can manage each of these links. Do they have an easier time putting white and good together, and so using the same key to indicate both, than putting white and bad together? It turns out that the second combination is easier for white participants and many African American participants as well. This seems to suggest that the participants arrive at the experiment already primed to associate each race with a certain evaluation and respond more slowly when the experiment requires them to break that association. Beyond the role of stereotypes in influencing what we believe about other people and how we act towards them, it's important to understand that stereotypes also influence how the targets of those stereotypes act. People are heavily influenced by others' expectations, and this is plainly visible in the way that stereotype threat influences performance on tests. In one study, for example, experimenters gave intelligence tests to African American students. Before taking the test, half of the students randomly assigned were led to briefly think about their race. The other half were not. The results showed remarkably that the students who had thought about their race did less well on the test. In similar studies, women were given math tests, and just before the test, half were led to briefly think about their gender. This reminder led the women to do worse on the test. So these reminders about group membership might lead test takers to think about the stereotypes for their group and make the test takers anxious. They know that others expect them to do poorly, and they know that if they do not perform well, they'll confirm the stereotype. Ample research has confirmed that these fears distract the test takers, consume cognitive resources, and undermine their performance. But what biases do we encounter if we're judging ourselves or our own behavior rather than other people? Here we commonly fall prey to the actor-observer bias, that is, attributing other people's behavior to dispositional or internal factors while attributing our own behavior to situational forces. The actor-observer bias tends to be more pronounced in situations where the outcomes are negative. Like if you fail an exam, you're likely to blame external circumstances, like that test was too hard or the instructor wasn't fair. But when someone else fails a test, we often blame them, believing that they didn't study hard enough or they're not very good at the subject. It might not surprise you that judgments of our own behavior tend to be highly self-serving. We make attributions that let us see ourselves in a favorable light.
No, wait, but you can't say this. Look, I put on a ban. In other words, I stopped China from coming to the United States. I stopped Europe from coming into the United States long before the March date that you're talking about. So people should say I acted very early. That was a very hard thing to do.
When you do well on an exam, it's in your best interest to make a dispositional attribution.
I am so smart!
Instead of making a situational one.
That exam was easy!
The tendency of an individual to take credit by making dispositional or internal attributions for positive outcomes, but situational or external attributions for negative outcomes, is known as the self-serving bias. We can understand self-serving bias by digging more deeply into attribution. One model of attribution proposes three main dimensions: locus of control, internal versus external, stability, stable versus unstable, and controllability, controllable versus uncontrollable. Consider how we might explain our favorite sports team's wins. Research shows that we make internal, stable, and controllable attributions for our team's victory. Like, we might tell ourselves that our team is talented, internal, consistently works hard, stable, and uses effective strategies, controllable. In contrast, we're more likely to make external, unstable, and uncontrollable attributions when our favorite team loses. For example, we might tell ourselves that the referees were unfair, external, that the other team played at home, unstable, and that the cold weather affected our team's performance, uncontrollable. One of the most compelling things about social psychology is its ability to address some of our biggest questions regarding human behavior, often in the wake of horrible events in modern history. For example, in the 1960s, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram began what would become one of social psych's most famous experiments. He began his work during the widely publicized trial of World War II Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann's defense for sending millions of people to their deaths was that he was simply following the orders of his superiors. And this got Milgram wondering.
How is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience?
So for his initial experiment, Milgram built a phony shock generator with switches that could supposedly deliver shocks in increments from 30 to 450 volts, labeled with terms like slight shock to dangerous shock, up to simply XXX. The participants were paired with a confederate, who was someone that looked like another participant but was actually just one of Milgram's colleagues posing as a research subject. He then had them draw straws to see who would play the learner role and who would play the teacher role. The volunteers didn't realize that the draw was fixed so that they would always be the teacher, while Milgram's colleague, the confederate, would always be the learner. So the confederate was strapped to a chair wired up with electrodes in one room, and the teacher and a researcher went into another room with a shock generator that the teacher had no idea was fake. The confederate learner was asked to memorize a list of word pairs, and the participant was told that he'd be testing the learner's recall of those words, and should administer an electric shock for every wrong answer, increasing the shock a little bit each time. Then the confederate purposely gave mostly wrong answers, eliciting shocks from the participant. If the participant hesitated, the researcher gave orders to make sure he continued. Even Milgram was surprised by the first round of experiments. All of the volunteers continued to at least 300 volts, and about 2/3 of them delivered the maximum 450 volt shock labeled XXX. One explanation for obedience that Milgram received is that the person ignores the fact that the recipient of one's actions is a fellow human being. For example, one of his participants said the following:
"You really begin to forget that there's a guy out there, even though you can hear him. I just concentrate on pressing the switches and reading the words."
But this dehumanization of the victim allows the obedient person to think of the recipient of his actions as an object, not a person, eliminating any sense of guilt at harming another individual. The dehumanization of the victim in Milgram's study has a clear parallel outside the laboratory. Enemies in war and victims of atrocities are rarely described as people, but instead are referred to as bodies, objects, and numbers. This dehumanization is propped up by euphemistic jargon. The Nazis used terms like final solution for the mass murder of 6 million people, and special treatment for death by gassing. The nuclear age contributed fallout problem and preemptive attack. The Vietnam War gave us free fire zone and body count. Other wars gave ethnic cleansing and collateral damage. These dry phrases keep the thoughts of blood and human suffering at a psychologically safe distance. Over years, Milgram kept conducting his obedience experiment, changing the situation in different ways to see if it had any effect on behavior. What he repeatedly found was that obedience was highest when the person giving orders was nearby and perceived as an authority figure. This was also true if the victim was placed at a distance, such as in another room. Plus, participants were more likely to comply with the orders if they didn't see anyone else disobeying, that is, if there were no role models of defiance. Even in cases where no harm is involved, research has consistently established our strong tendency to conform. In a series of classic experiments by Solomon Asch, the research volunteer is told that they're participating in a study on visual perception and is seated at a table with 5 other people.
Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length.
2.
Two.
Two.
Two. Two.
What's the problem?
All the other people in the group are actors who purposely choose the wrong line. And because of that, the participants struggle to trust their own eyes. More than a third were essentially just willing to give the wrong answer. Variations of Ash's procedures have been conducted numerous times, and we now know that there's an increase in conformity with more Confederates, that teenagers are more prone to conforming than adults, and that people conform significantly less when they believe that Confederates will not hear their answers. Finally, more conformity is found in collectivist countries like Japan and China than in individualistic countries like the US. Compared with individualistic cultures, people who live in collectivist cultures place higher value on the goals of the group than on individual preferences. The experiments of Milgram and Ash show us that people conform for lots of different reasons, but they both underscore the power of situation. Another body of research generated by social psychologists was done in the wake of a highly publicized tragedy. In Queens, New York City, 1964, a woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked with a knife. And when the attack happened, she screamed for help multiple times and eventually died from her stab wounds. The reason the story became famous was because some neighbors could hear her struggle but didn't come to her aid. Ample subsequent research on the topic has shown that failing to help is often produced by the way people understand the situation. It's not that people don't care, it's that they don't understand what should be done because the situation is ambiguous. In the Genovese case, witnesses later reported that they weren't sure what was happening. Maybe it was a joke, maybe it was a drunken argument or a lover's quarrel. The situation is further complicated by the fact that various witnesses to the Genovese murder realized that others were seeing and hearing what they did. This circumstance created pluralistic ignorance. Each of the witnesses was uncertain whether there was really an emergency and looked to the others trying to decide. Everyone took the inactivity of everyone else as a cue to do nothing. But even when people are convinced that they're seeing and hearing an emergency, the presence of multiple bystanders has the effect of creating a diffusion of responsibility, with each bystander persuaded that someone else will take the responsibility and respond to the emergency. There's a nice study that illustrates this, in which participants were asked to join in what they thought was a group discussion about college life. They all sat in individual cubicles and took turns talking to each other over an intercom system. But actually, there was only one participant and all the other speakers were just voices on a previously recorded tape. The discussion began as one of the speakers described some of his personal problems, which included a tendency toward epileptic seizures in times of stress. In the second round, when the participant got to speak to him again, he sounded like he was having a seizure and began to gasp for help. So the question is, would the participant take action to help this other person apparently in distress? The answer was powerfully influenced by the crowd size. If the participant believed that she had been just having a two-way discussion, so there was no one else around to help the person in distress, she was likely to leave her own cubicle to help. But if the participant thought it was a group discussion, a diffusion of responsibility occurred, and the larger the group the participant thought she was in, the less likely she was to come to the victim's assistance. Although an important qualification is that larger groups seem to breed less helping only when the group members are strangers. When group members are familiar with each other, larger group size can actually encourage helping behavior. Apparently, the presence of others can influence us in many ways, in some circumstances facilitating our behavior and in others inhibiting us. But the presence of others can also dramatically change how we act. In a riot or a lynch mob, for example, people express aggression with a viciousness that would be inconceivable if they acted in isolation. Social psychologists believe that the key to crowd behavior is deindividuation, a state in which an individual in a group loses awareness of themselves as a separate individual. This state is more likely to occur when there's a high level of arousal and anonymity. Deindividuation tends to release impulsive actions that are normally under restraint. But deindividuation can also result from someone's merely wearing a uniform and having an assigned role. In essence, the person becomes the role. This idea was proposed based on a classic study known as the Stanford Prison Experiment by Philip Zimbardo. Zimbardo transformed the basement of Stanford's psych department into a mock prison and randomly assigned male undergraduate participants to the role of either guard or prisoner.
Milgram embraced me and said, "I'm so happy that you did this." He said, because now you can take off some of the heat that he's had to bear alone of having done the most unethical study.
Guards and prisoners wore uniforms appropriate to their roles, and prisoners were called by assigned numbers instead of their names. Now, the experimenter only gave few instructions to the participants and placed only few constraints on their behavior. And what rapidly evolved was a set of behaviors incredibly similar to those sometimes observed in actual prisons. Cruelty, inhumane treatment, and huge disrespect in all of the participants, which, mind you, were regular college students. The behaviors observed were so bad that Zimbardo ended his study after only 6 days rather than letting it run for 2 weeks like they planned. Though careful scrutiny of the Stanford prison experiment has since revealed a litany of methodologic problems that debunk many of the claims originally made by Zimbardo, there's also reasonable evidence for the effects of deindividuation beyond the confines of laboratory settings. A real-world example that's now become infamous is the abusive behavior of military personnel at Abu Ghraib prison. In the face of worldwide condemnation, many Americans struggle to understand how their own people could behave in such an unconscionable fashion. Some have argued that powerful social forces were at work here that included, among others, the power of deindividuation through reducing people to their roles. As we've seen, social psychology tackles many important questions and uncovers principles about how others shape our experiences and behaviors. From flirting, to arguing, to competing, to trusting, to succeeding or failing, social psych is the study of human interactions, the origins of these interactions, and the effects they have on us.